everyone, and welcome to the Wrestling Territories podcast. I'm your host, Troy. Welcome to the podcast. Tonight, we're going to talk about something a little different. It's another what if. So, we're going to talk about what if three NWA wrestlers didn't go to the WWF. Stay tuned. Okay, so what we're going to talk about tonight is three top superstars that were in the NWA in 1985 and or 1983. I'm sorry, and then what if they had still been in there in 1985? So we're going to talk about that. So, but first, let me just say this: I did have a podcast I put up a while back about Greg Valentine possibly becoming a Four Horseman member. He was approached by apparently Dusty Rhodes, J.J. Dillon, and Jim Crockett about it, and I did post this question on Arn Anderson's podcast earlier, and he stated that he had heard the rumor, but it would have been sometime after he and Tully had left for the WWF. So it had been after what was it, about September of '88 or so when Greg would have been approached about that. So it's kind of good to know that. But if you haven't seen that podcast about the Greg Valentine, the possibility of him being a horseman that I did, go back and check that out. And once again, thanks to Arn Anderson and Paul Bromwell for that. I enjoy their podcast. If you haven't ever seen Arn Anderson's podcast, go check it out. It's on YouTube. They're live. It's usually every Tuesday, and so it's cool. It's fun, and these guys they'll keep you laughing the whole time. So tonight, what we're going to talk about is three superstars that were there in Jim Crockett Promotions in '83 and early '84 and part of '84. So that's three different time frames there, but Roddy Piper, Greg Valentine, and Ricky Steamboat. So now Piper left kind of like early '84, just right after Starrcade and everything happened in '83 with the dog collar match with Greg Valentine. So he took off at that point. Greg Valentine stays until I think around, I think it's like March or so when he leaves and goes to the WWF. And then Ricky Steamboat stays until after Starrcade '84 and early into '85 because he's fixing to have a feud with Nikita Koloff that never takes place. So that'd been kind of interesting, right? So what if these three guys never left for the WWF? It'd have been very impactful for the WWF for sure. Okay, so the impact on WrestleMania would have been huge for this situation. So if first of all, if Greg Valentine doesn't go to the WWF, there's never a big feud between he and Tito Santana for the Intercontinental Championship, which is a heck of a battle. And then you never have him and Brutus Beefcake become the tag team champions. So that's kind of a big deal there. A more big deal is Ricky Steamboat not going to the WWF and never having the feud with Macho Man Randy Savage over the Intercontinental Championship. That would have been a huge missed opportunity there for both competitors. And then the one that's the biggest of all of them would definitely be Roddy Piper not being there at WrestleMania number one. Who would have been in Piper's spot? Would have ever happened? What kind of a main event would WrestleMania one would have been without Roddy Piper? So if these three guys stayed in the NWA, let's say they were happy with Jim Crockett Promotions and they wanted to stay there, it would definitely been a big deal because WrestleMania one may have flopped possibly or may not have had the biggest impact that it did. And then WrestleMania 3, which Ricky Steamboat and Macho Man stole the show. I mean, let's be honest, out of all the matches of WrestleMania 3, that was the best of all of them. So, with those two figures not being there, the WWF's got a little bit of a headache going on, right? And even Greg Valentine not being there. And I know Greg didn't have that big of an impact when it came to the main event in WrestleMania 1 or WrestleMania 3 with Steamboat and Macho Man. Still very significant that Greg Valentine be there and he was successful as he was in the WWF. But if you think about it, if these three guys stayed in the NWA, who would they been feuding with? Now it's been 40 years now since 1985, right? So I'm going to kind of focus in on that situation. So let's say those three guys didn't go to the WWF and they're there in 1985 JCP. Who would they have feud against? Well, we know Ricky Steamboat was going to have a feud against Nikita Koloff. That would have been pretty good. I mean, over the U.S. title maybe, because would Magnum TA took the U.S. title from Wahoo, or would they gave it to Ricky Steamboat and Nikita and Steamboat would have feuded over it? Hard to tell. Steamboat's a heck of a competitor, and what he said was he just didn't want to work with Nikita Koloff, who was really green and really worked really tough. And so Steamboat wasn't really willing to go into that feud with him. So if Magnum TA still comes in, which I'm sure he does, could you imagine that roster? I mean, with Magnum TA, Ricky Steamboat, Greg Valentine, and Roddy Piper. Now, does Roddy Piper stay a heel, or does it go stay a face, or does it go heel in 1985? And who does he feud with in 1985? So you got to look at 1985 as the who's there, right? I'm thinking Roddy Piper, Tully Blanchard would have been a good feud. Uh, as good as Dusty Rhodes and Tully Blanchard was in '85, I really believe that Roddy Piper, Tully Blanchard would have been a heck of a feud. If Tully staying a face or rather heel and Roddy Piper being a face. But Greg Valentine, when he was leaving in 1984, was turning face. He and Dick Slater had an issue with the U.S. Championship, and Greg Valentine was getting over as a face. So I'm kind of thinking that maybe with Greg Valentine staying there, there's a good chance that you could see Valentine work with a very young and green, up and coming Arn Anderson when Arn Anderson starts coming in. There's a possibility. Now, if you keep Greg Valentine heel, I don't know. I'm trying to think who would be a good feud with Greg Valentine as a heel. So let's see. So Valentine's a heel. Ron Garvin's there. That'd be pretty good. I mean, they ended up in 19, I think it was 88, 89 when Ron Garvin went to the WWF. So that would have been a pretty good feud. Or Raging Bull's there. Raging Bull and Greg Valentine would have been a heck of a feud. It necessarily didn't have to be for a championship, but heck, they tore the house down, I'm sure, and it'd have been good to have seen these two against each other. And so, Roddy Piper, Tully Blanchard, Nikita Koloff, Steamboat, you know, Greg Valentine, Arn Anderson, or Greg Valentine, Ronnie Garvin. Hard to tell, but it would have been very interesting to see where that would have went. So, in another thought process, so if you think about this just a second, in 1985, Wahoo's going heel. He's going to be feuding with Ric Flair. So if Greg Valentine stays face, those two had a big feud back in the day, back in the 70s when Greg Valentine broke Wahoo's leg. Now, there's a chance that you might have that role reversal in 1985, right? So Greg Valentine faces Wahoo McDaniels in a role reverse. So Greg Valentine's the face, Wahoo's the heel. There's a U.S. title situation going on there. And the thing was, Greg Valentine challenged or he and Wahoo were battling for the Mid Atlantic Championship. So that's what brought that whole leg breaking situation and all that going on. But anyway, they didn't have really. You could probably through the Mid Atlantic Championship back in there again between these two, possibly. Although the Mid Atlantic Championship was starting to get it dwindle at that time. By '86, it's gone completely. But I mean, you could still have it for a Mid Atlantic Championship or a U.S. Championship. In that role reversal spot, that would have been a pretty good feud between Wahoo McDaniels and Greg Valentine. Okay, so we talked about Roddy Piper, Tully Blanchard as a possibility for a feud. So how about this? How about Dusty Rhodes, Roddy Piper? Roddy Piper plays the heel. Dusty Rhodes is there as a big face. I think that would have got over pretty well as well. I think that any feud that you could have put together around this 85 time frame, and it would never happen for WrestleMania, would have been huge for Jim Crockett Promotions to have kept those three guys that could have been very instrumental to Jim Crockett, maybe exceeding and going past Vince McMahon. I know there's going to be some argument about that, but without Roddy Piper WrestleMania 1 and Ricky Steamboat WrestleMania 3, it does, I think, in my opinion, hurt the WWF. There's a lot of good feuds you could have had in 1985 with these three guys. They could have feuded with amongst one another, Ricky Steamboat, Roddy Piper, Ricky Steamboat, Greg Valentine. You could have kept kind of reinvented the feud between Greg Valentine and Roddy Piper. I mean, you could have had that going again. After a couple of years, after Stark 83, maybe by Stark 85, you may have those two going at it again. And maybe in even that role reversal situation where Greg Valentine's a face and Roddy Piper's a heel. There's a lot of possibilities of matches that could have happened if these three guys didn't go to the WWF. And, with Magnum TA coming in, could I have seen a Roddy Piper Magnum TA feud? Yeah. Or Greg Valentine in there with Magnum TA. Either way, it'd have been a good way to have had a good storyline out of it, right? Could you imagine tag matches with Magnum TA and Ricky Steamboat? Um, you could have seen that happen. Ricky Steamboat, Ric Flair, real early on, even before '89. That would have been good. Ricky Steamboat getting set up for a Stark 85 world title match. That would have been probably sold out, even better than Dusty and Rick, possibly at that point, because I think Ricky was still had a lot of momentum. Um, so Stark 85 would have looked totally different. And you would have had some good feuds that would have happened. It would have been a very big what if, and it would have been very interesting to have seen this happen. And I'm going to be doing more of these what ifs, but I got to thinking about this earlier. What about those three guys? What if they had never left for the WWF? Comment below with what you think. I mean, if that didn't happen, if all this didn't happen, how do you think WWF would have fared without Piper and Steamboat and Valentine? How would WrestleMania 1 look differently? Would it have been Paul Orndorff and Bob Orton versus Mr. T and Hulk Hogan, and how well would that gotten over? Roddy Piper was extremely charismatic and just absolutely phenomenal on the microphone. And he could really draw a lot of heat as a heel. So he was really instrumental in making WrestleMania 1 very successful with him and Hogan and Mr. T. And so without that going on, without that happening, I kind of feel like WrestleMania 1 would have been okay. The build up to it, the whole MTV thing, Cyndi Lauper, would it still happen? Well, probably, but how big would it have been, right? Would Paul Orndorff smash the glass record over top of Lou Albano's head? Would it been Paul Orndorff instead of Roddy Piper? And at WrestleMania 3, who would Macho Man have been facing? Maybe George Steele? Nothing against George Steele, but the matches with George Steele were just not the best in the world. And it's because of George Steele's style, right? The animal was the animal, right? But if it didn't happen with Ricky Steamboat and Macho Man in WrestleMania 3, it would have happened with Andre and Hogan, I'm sure, but they would have been the main attraction, and Steamboat and Macho Man would have never stole the show. So the WWF would look totally different. Jim Crockett Promotions could still been in business even longer than 88. And do you bring in people? And does Jim Crockett still buy out the UWF in Florida and Central States? Does he need to, especially if he's really moving high up on that? He probably would have done it knowing that Vince McMahon would have probably bought everything out anyway. But how things would have changed, with those three guys there. I think it could have helped out a lot. Could you imagine putting Roddy Piper and Greg Valentine together against the Road Warriors? That'd have been kind of interesting. But when Lex Luger showed up, would Greg Valentine been a Four Horseman in 1985? Would Ole been that spot? Would Ole been pushed out? Would it have been like, who knows what would have happened? There's a lot of possibilities. A Greg Valentine, Ric Flair feud would have been absolutely phenomenal. I mean, anything could have happened. Just with three different wrestlers that never left, it would have been huge for Jim Crockett Promotions. Anyway, but that's just how I feel about it. Let me know what you think. Until next time, God bless. See you soon.